I need to check the list of used names before writing. The band names are Patricia, Derek, Cassie, Howard, Nathan, Brooke, Oliver, Leonard, Claire, Marcus, Walter, Russell, Renata, Greg, Phil, Edward, Lily, Garrett, Vincent, Arthur, Conrad, Diane, Sylvia, Eugene, Stephanie, Bradley, Kyle, Frank, Megan, Colin, Dennis, Theodore, Sandra, Raymond, Pete, Harold, Clara, Norman, Evelyn, Richard, Gerald, Martin, Deborah, Ray, June. I'll use Douglas, narrator, 67, Yvonne, wife, Tessa, daughter, Miles, son-in-law, fiancé equivalent. Here, best friend, Irene, granddaughter, as unexpected ally. Wait. Per the analysis, I'm changing the betrayal dynamic. Let me craft a new story with narrator Douglas, wife Yvonne, his longtime best friend Carl, and his granddaughter Nora as the unexpected ally. I need to make sure none of those names appear in the band list. Douglas. Yvonne. Nora. Good. I keep a woodworking shop in the garage. Not a real shop, just a long workbench, a few hand tools, a scroll saw I bought 15 years ago and never quite learned to use properly. When things get heavy in my head, I go out there. I sand something. I measure something twice. I don't build much. Mostly I just stand there with the smell of sawdust and old motor oil, and I think I was standing out there on a Tuesday evening in October when my granddaughter knocked on the side door. She was 17, still in her junior year, and she had that look on her face that teenagers get when they're carrying something they don't know how to put down. I thought maybe she'd had a fight with her mother. That happens sometimes. She'd drive over and sit with me while I pretended to work, and we'd talk around whatever it was until she felt better. She didn't sit down. She stood just inside the door with her arms crossed over her chest, and she said, "Grandpa, I need to tell you something, and I need you to promise me you'll hear the whole thing before you say anything." I set down the sanding block. I've been married twice. My first wife, Tessa's mother, passed away from ovarian cancer in 2009. She was 51 years old, the kind of woman who remembered every birthday in the extended family, who made a full Thanksgiving dinner even when it was just the two of us, who laughed at her own jokes louder than anyone else did. Her name was Beverly, and losing her changed the geography of my life in ways I'm still mapping. I met Yvonne 3 years later. A mutual friend introduced us at a retirement dinner for someone from my old firm. I spent 32 years as a civil engineer for a county infrastructure department in central Ohio. And when you stay anywhere that long, you know everyone. Yvonne was warm, attentive, funny in a dry way I liked. She was 54. I was 61. She seemed uncomplicated, and after 3 years of grief, uncomplicated felt like the most beautiful thing in the world. We married in 2013. It was small. My daughter Tessa, a handful of friends, a reception at the restaurant in Columbus. My granddaughter was only 7 then. She sat next to me at dinner and held my hand during the speeches because she could tell I was nervous, even though she was too young to understand why. I'm telling you all of this so you understand what I had, what I thought I had, what I spent 11 years building and protecting without ever thinking to look underneath it. Carl has been my best friend since 1987. We met at a neighborhood cookout the summer I moved into the house on Mercer Street. He lived 4 doors down. We both had young kids, both coached Little League for a stretch, both watched our hair go gray and our knees go bad, and our fathers pass away within 2 years of each other. He was at Beverly's funeral. He sat with me in the hospital the night before she died. When I met Yvonne, he was the first person I told. When we got married, he gave the toast. There are people in your life who become load-bearing walls. You don't notice them holding everything up until you watch them walk out of the room. I want to be honest about one thing before I continue. I am not a man who ignores things. I'm an engineer. I look at structures. I look at load distribution. I notice when something is off balance. But there is a particular blindness that comes with trust. A willful smoothing over of small inconsistencies because the alternative is a conclusion you are not yet ready to face. Looking back, I can see the cracks going back at least 2 years. Yvonne switching her phone screen off when I walked into the room. Carl finding excuses not to come to dinner when she was home, and then later finding excuses to come when he knew I wouldn't be. A shift in how she talked about him. Too casual, too carefully neutral. The way she said his name like she'd practiced saying it that way, I smoothed all of it over. Every single crack. My granddaughter's name is Nora. She's sharp in the way that quiet people are sharp. She notices things and files them away and doesn't say anything until she knows exactly what she has. She gets that from her mother, who got it from Beverly. It's a particular kind of intelligence that I have always admired and slightly feared. She had known for 4 months. She told me she hadn't known what to do with what she'd seen. She was 16 when it started. She'd come over one afternoon after school to drop off something for Tessa, and Tessa's car wasn't in the driveway, and she let herself in through the back because she still had a key from when she used to stay over as a kid. She heard voices in the kitchen. She thought it was the television. It wasn't the television. She backed out of the house without making a sound. She drove to a parking lot 2 miles away and sat in her car for 40 minutes. Then she drove home and didn't tell anyone. She spent the next 4 months watching. Not in a dramatic way. She's 17, not a private investigator. But she paid attention. She noticed the days Carl's truck was parked on our street when I wasn't home. She noticed Yvonne mentioning Carl's name in specific contexts, always with a reason attached, always just slightly over-explained. She built a picture, slowly, the way you build a picture when you're not sure what you're looking at and you need to be certain before you say anything that can't be unsaid. She came to me in October because she'd decided she was certain. I didn't say anything for a long time after she finished. I stood at my workbench with both hands flat on the surface, looking at the grain of the wood. I was aware of my heart beating in a way I'm usually not. Then I said, "Tell me again, from the beginning. Leave nothing out." She told me again. Here is what I want to say about that night. I was not destroyed. I thought I would be. I've heard people describe betrayal as the floor dropping out, and I understand that metaphor, but that isn't what happened to me. What happened was more like watching a building I'd designed start to show structural failures I had missed. The grief was there. Of course it was. But underneath the grief was something colder and more focused, and I recognized it. I'd felt it once before. The night Beverly's oncologist told us the cancer had spread. It was the feeling of needing to think very clearly in a situation that wants you to fall apart. I told Nora she had done the right thing. I told her I loved her. I told her to go home and act completely normal and not to say a word to anyone, including her mother. She looked at me with Beverly's eyes and said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to be careful." I spent 3 days doing nothing visible. I went to work in the mornings. I consult part-time for a small engineering firm now, 3 days a week, mostly reviewing plans and catching the kinds of mistakes that younger engineers make because they learned on software and never learned to read the underlying math. I came home. I cooked dinner. I talked to Yvonne about ordinary things, the neighbor's fence, a movie she wanted to see, whether we should visit her sister in Dayton over Thanksgiving. I watched her, really watched her, for the first time in a long time. The way she looked at her phone, the way she angled her body away from me, sometimes without seeming to notice she was doing it. The practiced ease of it. She was comfortable with her deception in the way you only get comfortable with something you've been doing for a long time. On the 4th night, I called my attorney. His name is Warren, not a friend exactly, but a man I have worked with for 20 years and trust absolutely. I told him what I knew and what I suspected and what I needed. He didn't express shock or sympathy, which is exactly what I wanted. He told me to document what I could and to make no financial moves that would be visible and to call him before I said anything to Yvonne. I said, "How long will this take?" He said, "If you do it right, a while. If you want to do it right, you'll be patient. I have never been a particularly patient man, but I am a thorough one. Ohio is not a community property state. It's an equitable distribution state, which means the court divides assets based on what's fair, not what's equal." Yvonne and I had signed a prenuptial agreement in 2013, her idea actually, which I had appreciated as practical at the time and now appreciated even more. The agreement protected the majority of my premarital assets, the house on Mercer Street, my pension, the investment accounts I'd built during my first marriage. What she was entitled to was a portion of what we'd accumulated together in the 11 years since. Not nothing, but not everything. Warren told me to get my financial documents in order and to be very quiet about it. I was quiet about it for 6 weeks. In that time, I also did something I've thought about a lot since. I called Carl. I called him on a Sunday afternoon and I asked him if he wanted to watch the Browns game. He said, sure. Sounded relaxed, sounded like himself, came over with a 6-pack of Great Lakes Christmas ale because the seasonal stuff had just come out. We sat in the living room and watched 4 quarters of football and talked about the game and about his knee surgery he was putting off and about my granddaughter's college plans. I watched him the way I'd been watching Yvonne. With fresh eyes. He was good. He was very good. He laughed at the right moments. He looked me in the face. He drank his beer slowly and left at a reasonable hour and said, "Good game," on his way out. I stood at the front window and watched his taillights disappear, and I felt something I don't have a precise word for. Not hatred. Hatred is hot. This was cold and dense, like concrete that's fully cured. Nora had been texting me updates, brief ones, just factual observations. I'd told her to stop taking any kind of active role. I told her she had done her part and that I needed her to step back and just be a kid for a while. She pushed back on that in her quiet way. She said, "Grandpa, I'm not going to pretend I don't know what I know." I said, "I know. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to let me handle the part that comes next." She said, "Okay, but you'll tell me when it's over." I said, "You will be the first." The moment of confrontation, when it finally came, was not dramatic. I had expected it to be. I had rehearsed a version of it in my head, where I said something cutting and perfectly composed, something she would remember for the rest of her life. That's not how it happened. It was a Wednesday evening in late November. I came home from the office, and Yvonne was in the kitchen making pasta, and Carl's truck was parked in front of the house. I knew he was inside. She'd told me that morning he was coming for dinner. Just the 3 of us, the way we'd done dozens of times over the years. I sat in my car in the driveway for a moment. Then I went inside. I didn't say anything when I came in. I set my bag down in the hallway. Carl was at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and Yvonne was at the stove, and they were mid-conversation, and there was a half-second when they both registered my presence, and something crossed Carl's face. Not guilt, exactly, but an adjustment, a recalibration. I know that look. I've seen it in my own mirror when I was trying to hide something. I poured myself a glass of water. I sat down at the table. I said, "How was your day?" We ate dinner. All 3 of us. It was, from the outside, completely ordinary. Yvonne made a salad. Carl told a story about his neighbor's dog. I talked about a drainage project I was reviewing. Nobody said anything that mattered. After dinner, Carl helped clear the plates, something he always did, something I'd always appreciated. And Yvonne walked him to the door, and I heard the low murmur of their voices in the hallway, too quiet to make out. When she came back into the kitchen, I was washing a glass at the sink. She picked up a dish towel. I said without turning around, "How long?" She stopped moving. I turned off the water. I turned around. I looked at her. She said, "Douglas." I said, "I'm not asking you to explain it. I'm asking you how long." She held the dish towel in both hands and she looked at the floor and she said, 2 years. 2 years. I had been standing in my woodworking shop 2 years ago, sanding the same piece of oak I'm still not finished with, and the two of them had already been. I didn't finish the thought. I set the glass in the drying rack. I said, "Warren is handling everything from here. You should call your sister." She said my name again in a different way this time. Not an explanation, something closer to a question. I walked out of the kitchen. I went upstairs and I closed the bedroom door and I sat on the edge of the bed and I stared at the wall for a long time. I called Nora. She answered on the second ring. I said, "It's over," I told her. There was a pause, and then she said very quietly, "Are you okay, Grandpa?" I said, "I didn't know yet." She said, "That's an honest answer." I said, "I got it from your grandmother." There was a long silence on the line that wasn't awkward. It was just two people sitting with something true. Carl called me 3 times in the week after. I didn't answer. On the 4th call, I picked up and said, "Don't." He started talking anyway, and I said it again. Just the one word, and he stopped. He hasn't called since. The divorce took 7 months. Warren was thorough and calm, and Yvonne's attorney was not able to notch with a prenuptial agreement that had been properly executed and witnessed. She received her share of the joint accounts and the retirement contributions from the marriage years. The house stayed mine. The pension stayed mine. The investments from before 2013 stayed mine. She moved to Dayton to be near her sister. I heard to a mutual acquaintance that Carl sold his house and relocated to the Pittsburgh area, though I don't know the specifics and I didn't go looking. People ask me, when they find out, and people do find out, small communities being what they are, they ask me if I'm angry. They say it with a kind of readiness, like they're expecting me to perform something for them. Righteous fury. Visible devastation. I tell them I was angry for about 6 weeks in the fall, when the information was new and the nights were long. After that it became something else, something more like a room I used to live in and no longer need. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes after a betrayal like this. It's not just the absence of the person. It's the rereading of years of your own life with new information. Sunday mornings that were unremarkable at the time becoming, in retrospect, elaborate and awful. The casual mentions of his name over dinner. The vacations where I was relaxed because I trusted everyone in the room. I reread all of it. I reread it for months. But here is what I did not lose, my daughter, who called me every 2 days for the first year and still calls me every week. My house on Mercer Street, which is paid off and has a good boiler and windows, I replaced in 2018. My part-time work, which gives me structure and purpose, and the satisfaction of catching a calculation error before it becomes a $400,000 problem. My woodworking shop, where I have finally, this past spring, started actually building something. A blanket chest, simple joinery, nothing fancy. And Nora. She's 18 now, enrolled at Ohio State in the fall, studying environmental science because she has strong opinions about how we manage water infrastructure, and she did not inherit her grandfather's talent for keeping quiet about things that matter. She came over last Saturday. We ate lunch and she walked through the shop and looked at the blanket chest and said, "That's better than I expected." I said, "I've been practicing." She sat on the workbench the way she used to sit when she was small, feet dangling, watching me work, and she said, "Do you ever think about how it would have gone if I hadn't told you?" I thought about it for a moment. "I'd have kept smoothing it over," I said. "For years, probably. Would that have been better?" I set down the chisel. No, absolutely not. She nodded like she'd thought the same thing and needed to hear it confirmed. There's a version of this story where I am the foolish old man who was deceived and humiliated and stumbled through a divorce at 67. I know that's how some people read it, but that's not the story I lived. I lived the story where my granddaughter walked into a garage that smelled like sawdust and motor oil and sat with me in the hardest room of my life, and we figured out how to walk out of it together. Dignity intact. House intact. The things that mattered, intact. The things that mattered, intact. I wasn't the victim here. She made sure of that. The blanket chest is almost done. I'm going to give it to her when she leaves for college. She doesn't know that yet. I'm going to put a small thing inside it when I close the lid for the last time in the shop. Nothing sentimental, just a note. It will say, "You came to the garage." That's the whole thing. That's everything. Because it is. I've had a lot of time to think about cause and effect. Not in any mystical sense. I'm an engineer. I think in systems. Every outcome has an upstream condition. Every failure has a point of origin if you're willing to trace it back far enough. What happened to me didn't start the day Nora walked into my garage. It started long before that, in the small decisions I chose not to examine, the screen turning off, the carefully neutral tone of voice, the over-explained reasons. I'm not saying the betrayal was my fault. It wasn't. What I'm saying is that I participated in my own blindness, and that's worth being honest about. Trust, when it becomes a habit, can stop being a virtue and start being a kind of laziness. I trusted Carl and Yvonne not because I was paying attention, but because I had stopped paying attention. There's a difference, and I know it now in a way I didn't before. The thing about Nora is that she didn't look away. She was 16 years old. She walked into a situation she had no preparation for, and she didn't flinch, and she didn't gossip, and she didn't fall apart. She did the hard thing. She held it, carefully, for 4 months, until she was sure. Until she could come to me with something solid, instead of something that might only hurt me without helping me. That's not luck. That's character. You don't stumble into that kind of discipline. You build it, quietly, over years, through 100 smaller choices that nobody notices. I think about what it cost her to walk into that garage. She was protecting me, yes, but she was also risking something. The possibility that I wouldn't believe her, or that I'd react badly, or that she'd cause a rupture in the family that couldn't be repaired. She weighed all of that and she came anyway. Because she decided the truth mattered more than her own comfort. That is what moral courage actually looks like in ordinary life, not grand gestures. Just a 17-year-old girl knocking on a side door and saying, "I need you to hear the whole thing." Carl and Yvonne made their choices and they're living with them now. I don't spend much energy on that. What they did was a reflection of who they chose to be, and the consequences followed as naturally as water finding its level. I didn't manufacture their outcome. I just stopped shielding them from it. What I want to say, if any of this is useful to anyone listening, is this: intelligence without honesty is just cleverness, and cleverness will eventually betray you. Strength without integrity is just force, and force without integrity breaks the things it was supposed to protect. I had to lose a marriage and a friendship of 35 years to understand that the most important structure I was ever going to maintain wasn't a drainage system or a retirement account. It was the quality of the people I chose to stand next to. Nora chose me. She didn't have to. She chose it anyway. The blanket chest is almost finished. When I close the lid for the last time in the shop and bring it to a dorm room in Columbus, I'll know something I didn't know 2 years ago. That the people who show up for you in the hard rooms are the only architecture that matters. Everything else is just load-bearing walls. And some walls, it turns out, were never holding anything up at all.